John Lukacs, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So you reached out to me after, I think we did the podcast about The Liberator, right? The guy.
Correct. Alex Kershaw's book.
Yeah, Alex Kershaw's book. Incredible story, just following the 45th Infantry all the way from Italy to Germany. You reached out to me and said, hey, I've got another story that a lot of people don't know about, and the guy's incredible. His name's Ed Dyess. Before we get into the details, how did you discover this story of Ed Dyess, and why do so few people know about him?
Well, Brett, it's an excellent way to start off. Very few people know about Ed Dyess just because Battle of Bataan, it was the darkest, earliest days of World War II. It was a loss. I think, you mentioned Alex's book, and Felix Sparks. We tend to dwell on the victories, in terms of military history, especially, in the U.S. I think it is a, I don't know if it's an ego thing. Definitely, we don't want to talk about when things went wrong. That was a situation where things went very wrong. So I think that his story has been, as he was a big part of that battle. It was remains the largest surrender in U.S. military history. And that's probably the reason why we haven't heard that much about it.
Right. But, despite losing that, he did some incredible stuff. We're going to get into what he did because he is like a real life G.I. Joe. But before there, let's get to his background. Where was Ed from? Where was he raised? And he started off as a pilot. So did he have an interest in aviation even as a young man?
Yes, that's a great line to call him G.I. Joe. I've used Captain America quite a lot, and they're both interchangeable. He is almost a superhero type figure, and it's strange. I actually go back to your previous question. I was researching this story about this escape from a Japanese prison camp. It was the only large-scale POW escape of the Pacific War. Obviously, Colonel Dyess participated in that. He was a prime mover in that story. But it was through the course of researching that escape story that I got into the Battle of Bataan and Corregidor, again, the early part of the war in the Philippines, and Dyess's name popped up everywhere. So this is, long before he became a prisoner of war, before the Bataan Death March, he was basically G.I. Joeing it around in the Philippines, in the air, on the ground, and doing everything he possibly could.
So yeah, as a young man, he was kind of exceptional even as a young man. He showed a lot of leadership potential. He's kind of Mr. All-American even as a teenager, right?
Yes. He's, to get into his background, growing up in Texas, a small town called Albany, and basically it was the frontier. He was born in 1916, and, it was the kind of town where residents at this time, they remember Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp coming through there. There's a lot going on in the country at this time, and, in terms of progress moving forward, the new frontier was the sky. It was airplanes, the aviation boom post-World War I into the 20s. And that's, he got hooked. There were a bunch of guys, barnstorming pilots, World War I guys that would, land in these small towns out in the, middle of Texas, Midwest. They'd try to make a few bucks by taking up townspeople for airplane rides. And Ed Dyess, he got his first ride at the age of 4, and he was hooked ever since.
And he saved up for money, did odd jobs so he could take pilot lessons. Even as I think he was a teenager when that happened.
Right. Yeah, he worked several odd jobs in order to be able to take flying lessons. And I think it was one of those things where, I guess for a boy or something back then, I'm sure sports were a big deal. But I think a lot of these guys, they looked up to pilots and things who were doing these extraordinary technological feats. He was into Charles Lindbergh, I guess, instead of, Babe Ruth, but he was very resourceful. And again, keep in mind, this is, the Great Depression. Nobody was sitting around, watching TV or playing on the internet, or, no cell phones like that. So he was out and about. He was busy working and, like I said, doing odd jobs and, multiple things in order to indulge his love of flying, but also to sort of, further his education.
Did he sign up to be a Army pilot right out of high school, or did he have other plans and then got diverted there?
No, you know what? He was kind of, a jack of all trades in high school. Class president, obviously, his leadership skills, were evident from an early age. He was really into acting. He had a dramatic flair, and he was great at sports. Kept the flying thing on the down low. I don't think his mother wasn't very, very keen into it. So I think the flying lessons were very secret. And he ended up going away to school, a place called John Tarleton Agricultural College. It's now Tarleton State in Stephenville, Texas, about an hour away from Albany. outside of Abilene, where the Air Force Base is named for him. Graduated from there again, did all the same things in high school, kind of, was big man on campus. And then when he graduated, he was also an ROTC. That was a high school and college thing. So, he had that, I guess, early military tendencies as well. But, it's a great story. He was hitchhiking to the University of Texas in Austin. After he, got his undergraduate degree, he was going to go to law school. His father was a judge. He never got to Austin, though. He ended up being picked up by a flyer, a guy who had washed out of the Randolph and Kelly Field training program, which was called the West Point of the Air at the time, before we had an Air Force Academy. So he never made it to Austin. He literally and figuratively did a U-turn with his life and went back and told his father. He said that, I want to be a pilot, and I want to fly the fastest aircraft around. And there was only one way to do that at the time, and that was the United States military. So
how did he fare early in his military career? This was before World War II started, I assume, that he joined.
Correct. This was the mid to late 1930s. Once he was accepted into the flight training program, the West Point of the Air, and it was just, a perfect fit. Basically went to the head of the class in terms of leadership, flying skills, and everything that was needed. And kind of made his way up, through the ranks, and then became the country's youngest squadron commander in 1940. And
where was he stationed, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor? Did he have a role in Pearl Harbor at all?
No, actually, he was in the Philippines, and he left the U.S. He deployed in November 1941. He arrived in Manila Thanksgiving Day, 1941, which was about 2 weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so he was already there. He was, at the tip of the spear, I guess you could say, in terms of, our most far-flung outpost in the Pacific, the Philippines. And, it's interesting because Pearl Harbor really gets, all the attention December 7th, 1941, but December 8th was the date in the Philippines due to the, the international dateline factor. The Japanese, they hit Pearl Harbor once, and they hit them pretty hard, but they hit the Philippines December 8th. And the difference between, the famous day of infamy in Pearl Harbor, they kept coming back to the Philippines and kept leveling our forces there, throughout December. So Dyess was, he was in the thick of it from day one.
Yeah, and he shot down several planes, I think, in those skirmishes.
Yes, he shot down reportedly 6 planes, which would qualify him as an ace. You need five enemy planes to qualify as an ace. He shot up a Japanese truck convoy. Unfortunately, though, with the loss of records, and this was an early part of the war, again, there were no gun cameras on the fighter planes, P-40 Warhawks at the time. But that was kind of the least of his worries was at the time was, being able to get credit for shooting down the planes. Would have been nice, but, there were a lot of other things going on. Shortage of food, shortage of ammunition. There wasn't enough oxygen for the high altitude compressors. So these guys, they couldn't really get in any high altitude dogfights. So there was, he was making do with what he had. But again, the way that guy operated, he functioned spectacularly, with very limited resources.
How old was he at this time?
He started out, when the war started, he was 25.
Okay, so he's 25. So, about mid-20s, but still pretty young, right? I think
right.
It's funny. Sometimes whenever I tend to do this, when I think back to like World War II vets, I'm like, oh yeah, they were like in their 30s, but like these guys, like someone like 19, 20, 21, like flying big beef, bombers and fighter jets. Like these were really young guys.
Exactly. And that's something that I've always, found as amazing. Similarly, it's strange. I think we do have a tendency, when you're studying history, especially, you think back at the Revolutionary War, and you think of those guys as just being a bunch of old timers, and with the exception of Ben Franklin, they were all in their 20s. And I think Washington was, in his low 30s, so these guys were all very young. And, it was similarly with World War II. These guys are put on the front lines right off the bat. And again, as he was in the service, before the war. Obviously, wasn't a part of the draft. He wasn't, he was in it from day one. So he was one of those guys that was kind of learning as he went. As a young guy. And started out as an amateur commander,
right,
and literally becoming a professional in a matter of weeks.
All right, so here's Dyess. He's beginning of the war, basically an ace because he shot, shooting down Japanese Zeros, but suddenly, like he has to become an infantryman. So he goes from fighter pilot to, basically a grunt on the ground. Like, how did that happen? Why did he have to go from being a pilot to an infantryman?
It was a really unfortunate turn of events. The famous line that Dyess uttered, he joined the military to fly planes. He wanted to be, fighting a war in a cockpit, not in the jungle. He was out on patrol as an infantryman, and he was overheard to remark to one of his troops that he'd rather be back home in Texas, staring at the southbound end of a northbound mule. He was, he wasn't happy with the situation, but again, the exigencies of the situation, the Japanese had a blockade on. The main Pacific battle fleet was basically demolished. We lucked out that they didn't hit any of the carriers at Pearl Harbor, but we couldn't muster force for any convoys. We couldn't relieve the Philippines. We couldn't get reinforcements, supplies. After a while, attrition basically took care of our small air force in the Philippines at the time. And so Dyess was taken out of the cockpit, handed a rifle, and sent into the jungle.
Yeah. And I think, part of the problem too, we talked about this we did a podcast about Lucky 666.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, at the beginning of the war, the strategy for the Allies was Europe first, right? So like most of the resources were going to Europe, and, the guys in the Pacific weren't really getting that much.
Exactly. You nailed it. And to be perfectly honest, I think, to go back to even the first question, why have we not heard of Ed Dyess? Why isn't this story, gotten more attention? Is I think there still is a Europe first mentality. I think I don't know the exact numbers, but if you look at, publishing houses, Hollywood, European movies, European theater stories are predominant. And I think that's just partially a factor of most people have some type of historical or hereditary ties to Europe, to the continent. And it was just a more, a romantic type war. You're basically dealing with a bunch of, natives don't speak English. There's no big cities. There's nothing that geographically or historically connects anybody to all these little islands and atolls, basically out in the middle of nowhere. And so, yes, I mean, he was suffering from the Europe first strategy, where the lion's share of the United States and as the arsenal of democracy was sending around the world. The Philippines got very little of it, and that's a great tragedy. In my opinion, is the decision was made, obviously a strategic one, that we would be basically supporting the war efforts of almost every other country, Great Britain, Soviet Union, but yet our own guys were left out.
Right. But so Ed didn't like the situation, but he still made the best of it. Like, what did he do to overcome this challenge, especially the challenge of leading men who are probably demoralized because of the situation?
Right. And it's, again, he was fortunate in having these very special, this innate talent for leadership. But the men under his command, they weren't really digging the new roles either. And keep in mind, it's a lot different than current military training, where almost everybody has some type of has to qualify for marksmanship, or knows how to pitch a tent, or spend the night out in the field somewhere, use a compass, go on long hikes, endurance, stamina, that type of thing. Back then, the military training was a lot different. If you went in the Air Force, you're going to be a pilot. You spent your time around planes. You were going to be a mechanic. You were taking apart engines. And so these guys had no idea how to be basic field soldiers. That was just a product of the era. But Dyess, thankfully, through his background, his upbringing, growing up again kind of on the frontier in Texas, he knew how to ride a horse. He was handy with firearms, and so he was able to sort of transmit that knowledge through his leadership skills, through the force of his personality, basically, to sort of serve as a commanding officer, but also a drill sergeant, also a weapons expert, communicate everything he knew to his men. And I think these guys are very fortunate that he did have that background, that upbringing and training, and I think it helped them get through a very difficult situation.
Right. What I thought was impressive, like he didn't wait around for someone to tell him to do that. He just did it. Like, he saw a problem and he just like, all right, I need to show these guys how to shoot, and we're going to train for that now.
Exactly. I mean, there was, it was funny that, some of the stories I've heard, and I've been fortunate to interview guys who served with him in his unit, and they're basically all gone now, except there's one sort of lone survivor left. And from what, this gentleman told me, Lieutenant Colonel Calgill, John Calgill is his name, Dyess didn't believe in sitting around. He was obviously a junior officer, so he knew how to take and fulfill orders, but he was very proactive.
All right. So Dyess in the Philippines, because he's there, he had the opportunity to take part in America's first amphibious battle of World War II. So tell us about that battle.
February 2nd, 1942, the Battle of Aglolema Bay on the west coast of the Philippines, the Bataan Peninsula. Very, very extraordinary circumstances, but, trying times, bring out the best in extraordinary people. And Dyess was there at the right time, the right place, and the right moment in history. It's really hard to describe how a fighter pilot ended up leading America's first amphibious landing of the war. He had demonstrated such proficiency as an infantry leader, as a ground pounder, as a real true warrior, instead of just being a flyboy, that high command, they figured that there was only one guy who could successfully pull off this mission. And Dyess, he jumped at the opportunity.
Yeah, there's this line you describe in this document you prepared for the Texas Medal of Honor. You talk about the men were they were in a dire situation. It was a tough battle. And then Dyess is able to rally his men. I loved what he said. Can you talk about how did Dyess rally his men who were just kind of, were sitting still out of fear, basically?
Right. Yeah, he was, at the time, and to give you a little bit of background, the Japanese intended to conquer the Philippines in 45 days. That was their timetable, their schedule, because they wanted to get south, the very oil-rich resources, the Dutch East Indies, break through that barrier and cut off the Allied supply chain to Hawaii and to the West Coast. They wanted to get down to Australia, but they needed to conquer the Philippines and do it quickly. And they got kind of desperate, so they tried basically an end run on Bataan, landing 2,000 troops in hopes that they could, get behind our lines and sow chaos in the rear echelon and bring this campaign to a conclusion. But fortunately, these airmen, Dyess, the 21st Pursuit Squadron, a lot of shipless sailors, and a similar kind of a hardscrabble ragtag outfit stopped these guys in the jungles. And then, when the landing took place, is because there were a few of these Japanese soldiers left. As you studied the war, that the fanaticism of the average Japanese soldier was basically unmatched by any other combatants during the war. So there was a handful of these guys that refused to surrender. But unlike, the History Channel documentaries and all the old newsreel footage, these guys didn't have flamethrowers. They couldn't call in airstrikes. They didn't have any ships to bombard these guys offshore who had, fortified themselves in these caves and these little redoubts, on the coast there. So we had to make an amphibious landing, and that's where Dyess came in. He organized and planned the whole mission from start to finish, handpicked the guys from his unit, guys who were, the crack shooters in the outfit, guys he knew were tested under fire and they wouldn't crumble or wilt. But this was a new thing. I guess it was one thing to be able to ask these guys, these airmen, these pilots and mechanics to fight in the jungle. It's another thing to ask them to charge up on a beach, in terms of enemy fire. So a lot of them did freeze, and partially fear, partially you have no training to fall back on. But in that Dyess, he was the first one up on the beach. He's firing a Lewis machine gun, basically from the hip, almost a Hollywood type cowboy story. So Dyess is up on the beach there. Japanese planes are shooting at him, dropping fragmentation bombs, plus these entrenched soldiers, that are hugging the shoreline there in their little rocky caves. They're firing at him. So he's basically trying to, handle this entire situation and get these guys to join him on the beach. So he's not the only one fighting this, making a one-man landing. I guess the best way you could describe it was he shamed them into being men, into doing their duty, and they all kind of snapped out of their funk and they joined him, and battle made a successful conclusion and ended up stopping the Japanese threat. Long story short, the Japanese planned on taking the Philippines in 45 days. It took them 120.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he said, come on, men, aren't you men? I mean, that description, it sounds like from a John Wayne movie, World War II movie. It's like textbook.
Exactly. It's like Sands of Iwo Jima. It's an old black and white. You can imagine him there, exhorting these guys to do their duty. And he was basically, calling out the manhood of these guys. You'd rather almost get shot, maimed, wounded, killed then appeared to be a coward. These guys, they looked after and they looked up to Dyess. And I think they wanted to emulate him, in that regard. He was, he was a leader, but he was a man among men, not just, in the air or on the ground, but in pretty much everything he did. So, they didn't want to let him down. And I think that was a big part of it as well. I mean, they liked him so much. And, again, wasn't a fear thing. It wasn't a disciplinary thing. I mean, it was, they wanted to prove they were men, but they also wanted to be accepted by Ed Dyess, by their commanding officer. And again, this wonderful, warrior, but a great human being who they looked up to and aspired to.
So what was the outcome of that battle? Did they win?
Yes, they completely wiped out, all the Japanese on the beachhead with only actually one casualty, which out of 20 some men is unbelievable. Sometimes you can confuse bravery and glory, and all those things. And like I said, rushing into the battle, with little regard for your own personal safety. But Dyess, he wanted to bring his guys home as well. I think he did think of them as a family. So he was not just a commanding officer and a friend. He was also kind of a father figure, even though he was only, in some cases, a few years, older than these guys. I think he thought that, hey, Uncle Sam trusted me with their lives, and I want to do my best to get them, home to their loved ones and their families. He wasn't always playing Rambo. Let's just say that he was trying to save lives as well.
So what happened to Dyess and his unit after the Battle of Egloma Bay?
Well, after the successful landing and the conclusion, that was the climax of the Battle of the Points. And, medals were handed out. Dyess, the other pilot with him, received the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest medal for valor you can receive in the U.S. military. The enlisted men all received silver stars. But for Dyess, the bigger reward was he was returned to flight duty. We, had managed to cobble together a handful of planes. And so he was basically put in charge of all air operations on Bataan, and which was running what was called the Bamboo Fleet. It was a small number of aircraft. A lot of them were unarmed, basically sort of training planes. So he started figuring out, okay, what can I do with this small handful of planes? How can I, again, be on the giving part of it instead of taking it? So he was returned to flight duty and started putting together more targets for the Japanese.
But he eventually gets taken prisoner at Bataan. So how'd that happen?
That's another part of, sort of Dyess's myth. His legend is that he was ordered, to evacuate the Philippines. Obviously, high command saw that the battle was going south. Obviously, as a skilled squadron leader, pretty valuable to the war effort. They wanted him out of there. And you think about it, pilots don't do very, can't really help their country behind barbed wire. So they wanted to evacuate Dyess. But again, Dyess, his responsibility to his men, his sort of definition of leadership required him to stay. He wasn't going to run out on these guys. And I think he felt as though anybody who tried to get off, the Bataan was, lacking in their duty or their sense of manhood. So he sent out basically everybody in his place, which is, again, the way he was, very unselfish and very, the best way you could say it is, he did care about others more than he cared about himself. That's how he ended up becoming stuck on Bataan and had the misfortune of being in the infamous Bataan Death March.
And how did he fare during that and during the Bataan Death March?
Well, the Death March was actually, as bad as you can imagine, as it's been portrayed in history through books and stories of that nature. Dyess had it a little bit worse, just because he was taller than the average GI, blue eyes, blonde hair, that type of thing. So it made him a target, and plus he was an officer, so he was a pretty big target for abuse from the Japanese. He took it in stride, literally and figuratively. I think he understood that if he could deflect some of the blows from his men, from wounded guys, that was no question. He would do that. Again, the guy never ever gave up on anything he ever did in his life.
So I'm curious, did he? I guess so. It sounds like he continued his natural leadership role even during the march.
Definitely. The line that he uttered was, he said, we were surrendered, but we didn't feel licked. I think there was a sense of, that these guys didn't lay down their arms out of any type of cowardice or fear. They were ordered to. And so he, even though he was no longer a warrior, he was a prisoner. I think he took the same mentality as he did in combat. Again, whether he was in a cockpit or out in the jungle, to survival. And he sort of transformed from that mindset to being a survivor instead of a prisoner.
So where did the march go to? What prison camp did he go to?
Well, the march was actually the Bataan Death March. It's one of those confusing things where you think it's just one endless line of prisoners. It was more or less a series of marches, by different numbers of prisoners, and which the Japanese had collected in various groups, and they would move out in specific days. And from start to finish, the march took about 60 miles north into Luzon out of Bataan. And depending where you were on the road, where you were on Bataan when you surrendered, these guys started trickling into the first prison camp anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks after the surrender. And that first prison camp for all the men captured on Bataan was called Camp O'Donnell. And like I said, it was heading up into the plains of Luzon out of Bataan.
Gotcha. So how did he so he makes the break. So he's going back. So his G.I. Joe status, he escapes from the camp. How did he pull that off? Because not many people, I don't think, was he the only one to escape from a prisoner camp in the Pacific? Yeah,
well, he wasn't the only. I mean, there were a few other individuals, who broke out of different camps, and this is throughout the Pacific, throughout the Far East, the Asian mainland, China, places like that. But he moved from Camp O'Donnell to Cabanatuan, which was basically the largest holding center the Japanese had of American prisoners in the Pacific. Again, outside of Manila, plains of Luzon, but he was actually transferred to Davao, which was called the Davao Penal Colony, outside the city of Davao on the island of Mindanao, which was the southernmost island of the Philippines, about 600 miles south of Manila. And the reason he was sent there, along with, he was in a group of about 2,000 prisoners that were herded onto this merchant ship, crowded together like cattle pretty much, because the Japanese needed prisoners to work the penal colony. And that was basically a pre-war prison in the Philippine Commonwealth that was designed to be escape-proof. It was for all the worst criminals in the Philippines, all the murderers, rapists. It was kind of like their Alcatraz or their Devil's Island, and but it was also a plantation. And so the Japanese got this bright idea. Well, we have all these thousands of American prisoners of war. Let's put them to work, for the greater good of the Japanese Empire and to help the war effort. And so Dyess was one of those individuals selected to go there. Again, never say die, his can-do attitude. To the Japanese, that camp was escape-proof. That was, that no one had ever broken out of there, in its 10-year existence. But to Ed Dyess, there was no such thing as an escape-proof prison camp or or a mission that couldn't be accomplished.
So he escapes. Did he escape with other people as well, other men?
Yes, there were. It was a group of 10. 10 Americans, 2 Filipinos. The 2 Filipinos were convicts who had been incarcerated there at the war, both for murder, and they signed on as guides. 10 Americans. It was basically an all-service team, kind of an all-star team of, Dyess was an Air Corps guy, his wingman, Sam Graccio, his head mechanic on Bataan, Lieutenant Leo Bolins, plus 3 Marines, Captain Austin Schaffner, who was a manly man, if there ever was one, football player from the University of Tennessee. He was the ranking Marine officer. And there were two lieutenants, great friends of his, Jack Hawkins and Mike Dobrovich, and 3 Army personnel, a Coast Artillery officer who fought on Corregidor, plus 2 enlisted men. Steve Melnick was the officer, Major Melnick, and then Sergeants Bob Spielman and Paul Marshall. And the ranking officer was a Navy commander by the name of Melvin McCoy, who was one of those living geniuses who graduated from the Naval Academy with, the way I understand it, still has the highest ranking in mathematics in the Academy's history. So you have guys from basically every branch of the service, every part of the country, and Dyess again used his team building skills to select this group, this all-star team of escape artists to accomplish this mission.
And what happened? How did they make it back to the Allies? I mean, that's, escaping is one thing. It's, evading, that's often the hard part.
This is usually the part of the interviews where I say, well, buy the book or watch the documentary.
Right.
To not, give away the entire story. It's a fascinating, story of how these guys got out. Basically they walked out the front door. They outsmarted the Japanese. But then again, as one of the men, Bob Spielman, said, he said, there's no use in escaping if you're just going to go hide under a rock somewhere. He said,
Right.
you have to, you have to do it for a reason. They had a reason. They wanted to break the news of the Death March and the atrocities that the Japanese were committing against the prisoners of war, to their government, to the rest of the world. So they had the motive. They figured out the means, and basically, met up with friendly Filipinos, and figured out that there was a resistance movement that had formed after the surrender, and there were a lot of guys who didn't give up, and a lot of local. It was basically a Filipino army led by a few American officers that had managed to stay out of these prison camps, and they had coordinated with General MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, and they were receiving supplies. Sounds sort of trite to say it, but he basically flagged down a ride with a submarine.
Right.
And that's how he reached friendly forces. It was him and two other individuals, Lieutenant Commander McCoy and Major Melnick, who were the first three to get out of the Philippines to meet with MacArthur in Australia, and they were the first ones to bring out the word of what was going on in the occupied Philippines behind Japan's bamboo curtain, so to speak. They were the first to bring out the news of the Death March and the atrocities and what was going on in these prison camps.
But here's where things get kind of crazy, because you figure, they're telling the government officials about the Bataan Death March and what the Japanese are doing. Like, the government says, okay, thanks, but like, don't tell anybody. Like, what was going on there? Why didn't the government want these guys to talk publicly about what was going on in the Philippines?
Exactly. It's remarkable because, again, you're looking back and it's historical hindsight. Hindsight's 2020, and you think of, boy, these guys just pulled off probably, the greatest escape of World War II. I think I think Hollywood gives all the credit to the guys in Europe. That Steve McQueen movie, the Great Escape in Europe. But what these guys did, they pulled off something that was impossible. They escaped from an escape-proof prison camp, stuck in the middle of this giant swamp, alligators and headhunters and all these things. Got off an island surrounded by the Japanese Navy, somehow got to friendly forces. And so you think that would probably be worthy of a ticker tape parade. And but the government thought differently. And again, it goes back to what we discussed a few minutes ago. The Europe First policy was the order of the day strategically. And the United States government, keep in mind, the time period of the war that this happened was kind of a gray area, of the war. 1943, middle part of the war. We had gotten past Pearl Harbor. The dark early days where there was nothing but a succession of bitter losses. To turning the tide in Midway, Guadalcanal. So we had the Japanese basically kind of holding them at bay. We had reached a stalemate with them to a certain extent. But in Europe, the invasion of Europe was being planned. So late 1943, you're looking at D-Day in June of 44, and the government didn't want to upset the strategic apple cart with the invasion of Europe and everything that had to go into planning that, in terms of keeping all these disparate allies, Britain, France, Free French, and and all these other countries on board with the plan. That they didn't want to disrupt planning for that, jeopardize it, because they knew that if the American people heard what was going on, what the Japanese were doing to their prisoners of war, it would have created such a dramatic outcry for revenge. A lot of people would have begged the question: wait a minute, Japan attacked us. They snuck attack us at Pearl Harbor. Why are we putting them on the back burner? Why are we concentrating on Hitler and Germany first? If you find out your guys are being beheaded and tortured and treated in all these despicable ways, I think that the American public would have, there would have been a vociferous outcry to make a Pacific first policy instead. So when Dyess and these guys, first came home, there was no there were no ticker tape parades, and there was no heroes homecoming. They were told to shut up and keep quiet.
But eventually, the government released the story, and that catalog. I mean, that caused it happened exactly what they thought would happen. The public was just like, "No, we got to do something about this."
Exactly, and I think that again, I get into this in much greater detail, in my documentary and on Colonel Dyess is. There's not just, we may think now, I think there's a lot of, low approval ratings for all of our politicians, but there weren't any idiots working in the government back then. They figured out, well, hey, we need to harness, this anger and this outrage. And they did it by basically sort of controlling the flow of the story when it was released to coincide with war bond sales. And, basically sort of creating a spark. Again, this was a period of the war where a lot of people aren't familiar with. Again, kind of right smack in the middle of things between these, more well-known historical events, and not a lot of people are aware that the war did drag on for 4 years, and it wasn't a concerted, high output, high emotional feeling situation for the duration of those 4 years. I think there was, the initial, outrage over Pearl Harbor. And then, again, we had, some tide turning victories, but things had sort of stagnated at this time. People were kind of taking it easy. We weren't being threatened with invasion on the West Coast anymore. Hitler had been turned back in Russia, and, things were going in a better direction. I think people started getting a little complacent. War plant industries, people were taking days off. They had problems with, hiring and output. People weren't buying bonds for the war. I think everyone was kind of just getting tired of, the endless slog of this fight. But this story, the government expertly turned it around as a pretty much an ingenious propaganda move to light a fire under everybody.
What happened to Dyess after this? Did he go back after he went back to America and back to the Allies? Did he get back into battle, or what did he have? Did the government have other plans for him?
We talk about this, G.I. Joe and Captain America, and he is almost this great Hollywood built or, Hollywood dreamed up hero, but there isn't a happy ending, unfortunately. He was preparing. He was going to get back in a cockpit. He was going to take command of a squadron that was heading over to Europe, flying P-38 Lightnings, which was at the time one of the fastest, most heavily armed fighters that we had during the war, and one of the most fearsome in terms of the way the enemy regarded it, in both theaters. And so he was preparing to do that. Fortunately, he suffered a tragic plane crash over Los Angeles, Burbank. And it's really, again, tragic. But you think about all the things that this guy went through. Survived aerial combat, ground combat, leading the first amphibious landing of the war, nearly a full year as a prisoner of the Japanese after the infamous Bataan Death March, escaping from a prison camp. He's being on the run for several months, and surviving the jungle and all those things. To die in a freak plane crash, it defies convention.
No, yeah, it reminded me of how Patton died. Right? Like he died in a car crash after doing all this stuff in Europe, and his last words were, "This is a hell of a way to die."
It's amazing. It really was. You think about that again, plus Patton's life. If you look back, bigger picture, how he was wounded in World War I, and all the adventures he had, and in terms of being a great horseback rider and everything else. You think about all the things that these guys went through. And MacArthur was another one. He'd been shot at everywhere, for close to 30 years in his military career, and was always, very daring and brave, to sort of escape fate, so many times. I guess maybe Dyess just sort of, was so much of a man, he just kind of ran out of luck, or ran out of his 9 lives, I guess you could say.
Right. So he's 27 at this time. So still, young man. So as you said, he did all this stuff. You kind of went through what he did in 2 short years. You hear this like, man, this guy should win the Medal of Honor or be awarded. Did that happen to him?
No, that's it's again another tragic aspect that made it sort of a sad ending instead of a happy ending. He had several opportunities where he could have been could have been awarded the Medal of Honor. Again, there were things that happened over in the Philippines, obviously, in terms of loss of records and, being a part of a losing battle. Things didn't go the right way or break for him. And, you need people to recommend you, and all the paperwork has to be in order. And that was, again, it's a loss. So you're burning documents and records and things like that. So, he was unfortunate in that regard. He was also, I think he was recommended for it for his last heroic act, which was he died in that plane crash, but he saved the life of an innocent bystander, a motorist who had strayed in his landing path. Dyess could have saved his own life and probably crashed into this car on a street in Burbank, but he decided to try to, save the life of this, unknown motorist, and, in that regard, lost his. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the motion was denied, and he received the Soldier's Medal, which is a very prestigious award, but it's for action, not involving heroic action, not involving an armed enemy, and it took place on American soil. So, but I guess in terms of talking about a happy ending, I'm leading a movement, so to speak, to have Dyess recommended and reconsidered for the Medal of Honor, and hopefully we can rectify this past wrong, which a lot of things happen according to fate and things out of his control. But I think there was also some resistance from members of the President Roosevelt's administration and other people. So it was semi-political. Again, Dyess was the kind of a survivor of the Alamo who shows up and wants to tell his story at a particularly bad moment, in time. So he was, kept quiet and, kind of pinned down by government forces, his own government forces in that regard. But, hopefully we can rectify this situation and get him the medal he deserves.
So, I mean, I love to take, there's so many lessons we can get from this guy, but the thing that stands out the most as I read about Ed's story was just his ability to inspire men and his leadership under fire. I mean, was that natural? Like, was that something he was just born with, or did he consciously develop that? Do we know that, or this is just he was just born with it?
I think it's a little bit of both, to be honest with you. Right? I mean, if you look at, again, I think the innate part of it, he was born with, the way to sort of carry himself, the way to to appear before others and to inspire people. I think he just had that natural personality where he could get people together. He was a team builder. He was someone who was a very inspirational, motivational type figure. But if you remember the small line I mentioned earlier when describing Dyess's background, his upbringing, his personality, he was a hell of an actor. He was always in school theatrical productions, and even once he joined the Air Corps, he still in his spare time acted in like local theater communities in Shreveport and at Barksdale Air Force Base, Hamilton Field out in San Francisco. So he kept up his acting skills in that regard. So I think he was also sort of aware of how he carried himself and how he could appear. And, he could put on a good show. Let's just say that. I think if you add all those things up together and in sum, that's what made him, a great leader. But it wasn't an act. It truly was him.
Yeah. Well, John, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go to learn more about the book? Or not the book, it's the documentary.
Right. Well, the documentary focuses on specifically on Ed Dyess's exploits and, and his the way he, the way he led people, the way he, conducted his war, that brief 2-year period that you mentioned. The book covers the escape and, adds in the other characters, on a sort of a bigger picture. 450-page book, and then you have an hour documentary. Sometimes the documentary is a little bit easier for a lot of people, in a busy world to digest. You can go to 4-4-43.com. That's the name of the film, 4443. And you can sign the Medal of Honor petition that we have for Colonel Dyess. We're nearing almost 30,000 signatures right now. And so we're going to be getting that out there and sent to the folks in Washington with a lot of other materials, for this Medal of Honor request. So, all your listeners out there, if you can sign up for that, we'd really appreciate it. Add your name to the list, join the mission, so to speak. And also the film, the documentary, again, it's an hour long. It was a official selection of the GI Film Festival in Washington. And you can purchase DVDs there on the same website, 4-4-43.com. And all the proceeds go towards helping our this mission to get Dyess recognized and to get him the award that he deserves and frankly that he earned.
Well, John Lukacs, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Brett, hey, pleasure was all mine. Thank you very, very much for helping me share this story. Really appreciate it.
My guest today was John Lukacs. He's the author of the book Escape From Davao, as well as the filmmaker of the documentary 4-4-43. You can find out more information about the film at 4-4-43. You also buy it there. And you can also find out more information about John's mission to get Ed Dyess the Medal of Honor there as well. You can also check out our show notes at aom.is/Dyess. It's Dyess, where you find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.